Okay, so yeah, welcome to another one of our winter plant talk um, experiences, although it's not very wintry out today, which is lovely. So today's topic is a conversation with Nebraska native plant photographer Drew Granville. And Drew is going to share some of his photos, some information about some really cool native plants growing in the wild across the state, as well as information about the field guide that he is currently compiling. So we will get to Drew's presentation in a couple seconds, but first, just a few details. I'm Michelle DeRusha with Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, and we host this series of Plant Talk webinars each winter. We have two more to go in our series after this one. So mark your calendars. Next Thursday, March 6th, we have NSA Sarah Buckley talking about how and what to plant under your trees. So that should be interesting. And then our last talk for the season is on March 13th. And that's with Bob Hendrickson, Brad Kindler, and Justin Evertson. And they will be talking about keystone species, oaks, willows, and cherry trees. So you can register and learn more about these final two plant talks on our website, plantnebraska.org /plant-talks. We'll put that link in the chat. And then you can find recordings to all of our previous plant talks for this season on that page as well. Just as a reminder, we do record all of our plant talks and we send out a recording, the link to the recording on YouTube at the end of the day. So if you are registered for a future plant talk and you can't attend in person, that's okay because you will get a link to the recording. And then one more note, Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, if you don't know us, we are a nonprofit member organization. So if you're not a member of NSA, you can find out more about our different membership levels and benefits at our website, plantnebraska.org. And we will drop a link in the chat for that too. So just a reminder to keep your microphone on mute for now. If you have questions for Drew, you can put them in the chat, or you can turn your mic on after his presentation. We'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. And so with that, I will let Drew Granville take it from here.
Oh, hello, I'm Drew Granville. You probably heard that I'm a botanist. I'm kind of more recent in the state. I've did my master's at the University of Nebraska Omaha, actually in behavioral ecology with Dr. Claudia Rotter's lab, working with berry beetles. But I'd always had a considerable interest in botany. When I took my undergraduate courses and went on a guided walk with Dr. David Sutherland guiding it of Glacier Creek Preserve, I really was interested just talking with Dr. Sutherland, like at front of the line, just talking with him the whole time. And when I was taking my bachelor's degree block courses at UNO, I kind of learned that I really enjoyed taking the plant courses a lot more than like the molecular or other biological sections. So I pretty much took every single botany course that UNO offered. And when I got into the grad school with my master's, I also was able to be a teaching assistant for uh, flora of the Great Plains and vascular plant morphology. But also as a grad student, I'd always go up into the UNO herbarium just to visit Dr. Sutherland. And Dr. Sutherland is actually in this group right now watching, but I'd always visit him in the herbarium and just ask questions all the time at the end of the day after working in the lab. And when I graduated at the University of Nebraska Omaha with my master's in science, I would try to move on to getting into PhD programs with a berry beetle lab in Illinois State University. However, in the end, I got outcompeted because there was only 2 slots open, but they had several more applicants than they could that were available that could have the 2 slots. So in the end, I went back to Dr. Claudia Rotter's lab in 2021 to try and get my thesis published and produce some new original literature for that lab. But as you all probably aware, COVID happened. So I couldn't work in the lab anymore, but I had been taking up internships with Fontenelle Forest and Glacier Creek Preserve, just trying to learn about plants, basic level like habitats. Because my original idea was if I got into the PhD programs, I would want to be able to teach botany-based courses to be more widely versed. But when COVID happened, that pretty much just ended all my plans to be going out of state for my further higher education. So I decided that I enjoyed field going in the field so much, like that I would just explore the wilderness because you couldn't go out anywhere in public. And I thought like one in the spring, I wanted to learn how to identify calyxes, sedges, because they're very difficult. And I had learned in Florida, the Great Plains, that they were difficult, but I wanted to learn them. And so my idea was the best way to learn them was seeing them in person and understanding them in the field when they're fresh and green instead of mounted specimens. And I learned them actually very quickly and got them down. And then I wanted to learn grass identification and then all the spring ephemerals. And that pretty much I had. And then also I told myself I wanted to see federally endangered Western prairie fringed orchid. And I did find one on a private property near Papillion. So that I got my first photos of that. And also with Fontenelle Forest, they knew that I had a lot of experience with botany, was starting to, and they wanted to encourage me to learn even more. So they gave me full access to all their properties. I could go anywhere on their properties, and I just had paperwork in my wallet to say that I'm allowed to go anywhere on the Fontenelle properties, including some of their private areas that no one has public access to, that are not owned, not that are secret areas that are off properties that you know of as Fontenelle or Neil Woods. So I was able to start also doing research for learning to do research with Fontenelle Forest, such as GPSing every single oak tree on their property, except for the floodplain, to produce a heat map and all these other projects like seed collection. And also I was starting to assist with prescribed fire. So this, and I've come a long way since then. I actually, this was a photo that Chris Helser took of me assisting with prescribed fire at the Niobrara Preserve with Chelsea Forehead with Game Parks and Justin Bauer with the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. So you've also are aware that I'm working on an all-encompassing field guide. So what happened with that was I originally had been starting taking photos just for my own personal use, such as for future education. And I had photographed pretty much most of the plants on the Fontenelle properties and a lot of the prairies around Omaha. And people were seeing these photos and thought, Drew, this might make a good future book. But they thought at first just to do like redo the Fontenelle field guides by Neil Ratzlaff and Rowan Barth, and then maybe include the remnant prairies around Omaha. But I wanted to do something more because I was realizing that I was learning so much with all these plants that I wanted to learn more and more and more to. So I started approaching the edge of the sandhills and then started going into the prairies around Lincoln. And eventually I decided I just want to do an all-encompassing field guide. That's all the native plants of eastern and central Nebraska, because it's also the journey to build this to become potentially one of the best plant experts in the state, because it will open a lot of doors for me. So during COVID, David Sutherland invited me to the Nebraska Native Plant Society Facebook group. And back then it only had about 100 members on it. Now it has about 4,400 members, exactly because I've been posting so much on it. So the Nebraska Native Plant Society's mission was always about education and conservation. Because there's a lot of plants out there in the really remote areas that people have not even heard of, such as, or don't even know they're even present in Nebraska, such as Western prairie fringed orchid. So this is the proposed cover of my book. So I have come a long way with photography because back in 2021, I usually more referred to it just photo documenting because I didn't know much about photography, but that's changed when I met Jerry Steinauer on a burn at Indian Cave State Park. And we had scheduled some meetings at Fontenelle. So Fontenelle has always been laid the groundwork for me, forming connections with all these other conservation organizations in the state, like the Game of Parks or the Prairie Plains. So, but with Jerry's help and just thousands upon thousands and thousands of photos I taken, I learned how to take what I consider good photos. And if you saw the Nebraska Native Plant Society this summer, I did take new photos of Western Prairie Fringed Orchid in the Sandhills. So this is a federally threatened species. There's only about 2,000 to 5,000 plants left in Nebraska. But I know where multiple locations are of this plant, but this orchid is really known within the botany community for being extremely sporadic, where it can go up potentially 7 years between blooms or emergences because it's exceedingly weather dependent. So in eastern Nebraska, because of this, and in Iowa, because of this extensive drought we've been having for these years, it's been very difficult to find a specimen in bloom because it's just going to be skipping and skipping and skipping constantly. And even if I did find one, it might be really tiny and stunted, not a really showy specimen to reflect the species overall. But according to the literature that I have gone through on Google Scholar, the literature states that it needs several conditions to meet before you have the best chance of observing this plant in the wild. So first you need warm prior year conditions, non-drought, and then a cool, snowy, short winter and a wet early spring. So last year, 2024, those conditions were met in the Sandhills. So finally, I had my best option. It was to find a specimen in the Sandhills. So I got in contact with the, what's it called? The Fish and Wildlife to try and access a population on one of their properties deep in the Sandhills. And they are pretty stingy, even because of this is a very rare plant, that they had to fill up a lot of paperwork and get a sponsorship from the University of Nebraska Omaha Herbarium with David Sutherland. So my promise was I would include this information, this record into the UNO Herbarium. I would provide the Fish and Wildlife my photos, and also I wouldn't tell anyone where it is except for just saying the Sandhills. So this is a close-up of the flower. So quite the fringy appearance, but this is definitely an orchid. You can see the lip here and then the other anatomy trademark of it. So for this field guide, in general, I'm trying to follow a theme where it's multiple photos. Like if you've seen John Farr's field guide, he has a lot of inflorescence photos, but I'm trying to do inflorescence close-ups and the whole plant to show habitat. So this is a sedge meadow, but in eastern Nebraska, it's more associated with kind of mesic to lower areas in tallgrass prairies. But also identification traits that are very notable that's listed in the Flora Nebraska book, which is nicknamed the Botany Bible of Nebraska, is these exceedingly long nectar spurs, which I took photos of to distinguish that. This is a pretty iconic orchid, but since the Flora Nebraska Key just mentions this trait, I took photos of it. So I am referencing heavily the Flora Nebraska book, which is a very technical, very broad novel, but it doesn't have any pictures. So, but I'm trying to kind of get a middle ground between a nice showy field guide and a very technical novel with the Flora Nebraska book. So I'm having multiple pictures of each plant so that it's the key traits to identify in the field, because there are a lot of other plants that are more difficult to tell apart that need multiple photos to distinguish them. This is another endangered orchid. This is small white lady slipper orchid. There's even less of them in Nebraska, which is about 1,000 to 2,000 plants left in the state. So this was actually a new population that I discovered back in 2021 when I was still trying to learn sedge identification better. I went to a wet tallgrass prairie. It's, in eastern Nebraska. And when I was walking around the borders of the prairie, I discovered the colony and got it reported to the Game and Parks. And Jerry Steiner and I went out there with Glenn Pollock, and they confirmed it was an previously unknown population. There was well over at least 100 specimens in there. So that's the first time when my name got on the Game and Parks radar. And I enjoy revisiting this population every year, take more photos because there's definitely some improvements I can still learn from. And this was a whole plant photo I took of the orchid in 2022. So white laced birds are actually trap flowers. So what happens is a small bee has to go into that pouch and escape through the small holes at the back of the front petal-like stamen to rub against those fertile stamens. But the bee has to go in there twice. So they have to be pretty dumb to do that. But it does happen because I definitely see these orchids are getting pollinated. But as an orchid, they're very sensitive to disturbance, so they're an indicator of exceedingly high quality habitat, and their locations are kept secret because there's always poacher concerns with these orchids. But digging them up will most likely kill the orchid because they form symbiotic relationships with underground fungi called mycorrhiza. And if you dig up the orchid, you're going to kill the fungus effectively. And their seeds are microscopic because they have no endosperm to nourish it. So they have to form that symbiotic relationship with the underground fungi. So it's a very difficult to actually grow them successfully. But there are special lab conditions like florets and gardens that are having luck starting to grow native orchids. So there's another non-orchid federally endangered species in Nebraska. This is blow-up penstemon. So I so far have seen 3 populations of the 32 remaining in the state. There is also, besides Nebraska, a small population in Wyoming, and besides that, that's everything in the world that's left. So blowout penstemon is a blowout specialist, which needs these heavily eroded dune slopes or habitats where the winds have taken off most of the plant material and exposed the bare sand. And this type of habitat brings in specialist species, and blowout penstemon would have been one of the first to arrive on the blowouts. But because of European settlers and other people not liking fire and the loss of the bison herds, these blowouts have healed and have gotten retaken by the prairie. So, which has caused this plant to become nearly extinct. It was actually thought to have gone extinct in the 20s, and I think it was rediscovered in the 50s. So, but with seed collection and also transplanting, there's a lot of new introduced populations, but most of them are not doing well because they need constant active maintenance, like disturbing the blowout and bringing in new specimens and exchanging genes between populations. However, the lack of funding has become an issue. This is a close-up of blowout penstemon inflorescence. So note the bracts, which are very distinctive, very pronounced on this species. A macro close-up of the flower. So I did actually visit Samuel R. McKelvey National Forest in Cherry County, which is a very large sandhills prairie, but has ponderosa pine forest on the north end of the property. So I was on a mission to find prairie moonwort, which is a very primitive fern, and it only grows on these extremely steep north-facing ponderosa pine forests. So I had to go deep in the ponderosa pine forest, but it's exceedingly tiny, but I did actually find a couple specimens. And this plant has considerable conservation interest because it's listed as vulnerable and basically very little is known about it in Nebraska. So this is maybe what you might not think of as a typical fern, but it's considered one of the lower order fern groups, or Phylloglossales. So you've got the typical ferns, and then you've got these more primitive, older groups of ferns, which has one leaf that's modified to be only fertile, producing spores. This is a close-up of the fertile leaf or frond that would release the spores. And then this is the frond that's used for photosynthesis. What's interesting when I was talking to David Sutherland and Stephen Rossmeyer about this population is the leaves don't quite match the description listed in the flora of North America. So it might be an interesting study moving forward. So this the reason why I found this plant is because Stephen Rossmeyer, the third author of the Flora Nebraska book, gave me full access and notified me about the Northern Great Plains Herbaria database, which has compiled hundreds of records or thousands well, most of the records that I'm using were more recent because by Robert Steiner, Stephen Rossmeyer, Jerry Steiner, for example, just their travels throughout the entire state. So I'm going back on their finds over the decades and backtracking to refine these plants that they cataloged years ago to prove that they're still there, and then doing my photography to integrate them into this field guide. Because most of the plants, iconic plants that you normally think of that are local, like Fontenelle Forest or some of the remnant prairies like 9 Mile Prairie, I've already done. And now I'm going further out to get some of these more unusual species. Because when I said I was doing an all-encompassing field guide, I meant it. Currently, I have photographed over 900 native plant species in the state, which are all clustered in eastern and central Nebraska, and I'm still going. Approximately, there might be around 300 species left to make it truly all-encompassing. Some of those I doubt I'll ever find, but most of them are doable within my skill set. So also I have been accessing sandhills fens in the sandhills, which are alkaline wetlands that take thousands of years to form. And in these habitats are species that are specialized in these wetland habitats. So what's always interesting when I walk into a fen, the border is like walking on a waterbed. So that's when you actually know you have entered the fen. Close up. So this is tall cotton grass. So it's actually a sedge. So one of those miscellaneous unusual sedge species that grows in these habitats. And there's a couple of species. We'll talk about the other one next. But the way you tell these two cotton grass species apart is the bracts on the back of the inflorescence head. There's two lobe bracts here. And this one's also more evident that it's colonial based. But this is the other species that I accessed in another fen back in 2023. Not as showy as the other one, but it is different. This is slender cotton grass in close up of the sedge structures. But in the back, it only has one bract pointing. So I have both of them in the field guide integrated and discussing the key differences. But these are probably plants that most people won't see. But I also consider this field guide intended for experts in the field. So you'll have people interested in the book for education, but also for ecologists and biologists that definitely will need to know some of these identification traits. There's also some really showy flowers in these fen habitats. This is bog buckbean. So a very brief bloomer, but if you catch them right, they're always very showy. So a lot of them in this fen were vegetative, but it's growing right out of the water surface. There was also some interesting stories. So in 2023, I was focused on the Niobrara Valley Preserve photography out there, just specifically on property. 2024 was mostly just more of the sandhills around in the Niobrara Valley and sandhills border there. But one of my main goals in 2023 was getting photos of a very large purple pincushion cactus specimen in full bloom. And this plant is quite known to be difficult to catch in full bloom because each of those flowers will only last one part of the day once. They'll open once and then they're closed permanently. So first, I had to find a suitable specimen that I wanted, that I was going to dedicate my time to. So I was exploring the East Bison pasture extensively, and I ended up my first week in the spring staying at the Niobrara Valley Preserve. I found the ideal specimen that was easy to access for me. And I knew that this cactus blooms in pretty much early to mid-June. So when the time came, late May, and then I monitored this specimen every night for 2 weeks until finally, I believe it was June 7th, all of the flowers were open at once and I got my photos done. So this one was completed. Well, I got a close-up of the flowers too. But also there's another cactus species called Missouri pincushion cactus that is different besides the more peach or yellowish colored petals. It's got the spines that are a little bit different, where this one has two types of spines on it. The other one just only has one type of white spines on the nodes. So I had to get that photographed. Also, there was another showy shrub that was in the Spring Branch Canyon habitats that was called prairie ninebark that I wanted to get photographed. So this one was more just an interesting story because I had already been aware of this one because of Sabrina Russo's team had found it in a prior survey. But there's bison in the East Bison pasture, of course. And they also go in the woods, these habitats. So we were having frequent encounters with an old bull in the woods. So he was freaking enough that each of us had a name for that bull. So I named him Frank because like watch out for Frank from like the Cars film reference. But this is more of I found this big shrub. It's called prairie ninebark, another rare shrub that grows in the Niobrara Valley. But it was on this overlook of the paper birch forest. And I had to get these ideal photos, I had to stand on a log in a marsh that went up, the water went up to my knees in taking these photos. But the Niobrara Valley floodplain is quite tick heavy, probably the worst tick area I've ever seen. And when I was taking photos of this, I looked down while I was standing on this log, and my legs going up to my chest were solid and ticks just crawling up me. So I take my photos, snap them, and then I just brush myself off constantly and take more photos and then brush myself off. And I got this thing done. It's close up of the flowers. So just all kind of botany stories that are going on. And there was another plant. Now this is 2024. I started switching focus that I wanted to photograph a plant called Princess Plume, which is a very showy native mustard species that grows on these shale outcroppings along the Missouri River. So Jen Corman with the Northern Prairie Land Trust, had seen some of the plants growing along the Missouri River on these shale outcroppings, but she had seen it on private property. I had called the landowner, tried to contact the landowner to get permission. However, there's always some of these landowners that don't. His answering machine required a password for me to send a voicemail. I'm guessing because he hated telemarketers so much. But so I was having trouble getting in contact with them to even ask for permission to access his land. But first plan A was to check Lewis and Clark State Recreation Area, which has a lot of shale outcropping, very high slopes on their property. It's a little bit further east of the property that Jen Corman had seen it while kayaking. And I hiked down those shale riverside for several miles, did not find any Princess Plume. So finally, I decided I was going to commit to that landowner. So I found out that his brother was Senator Barry DeKay. And so I contacted him through his government email, and Barry DeKay responded, and he got in contact with his brother and finally got me permission to access the Princess Plume population. So it was growing on these shale outcrops along the river. So I finally was able to get this plant photographed and looking up the flowers with the river in the background. So, and the close of the flowers and of course the leaves. So this was the view of the habitat there. So it was kind of awkward getting down there. It was not as bad as the other property, which was 1,000-foot drop, which I had to walk all the way around some animal trails to finally find a path down to get down there. But this one just had a little opening, like a little gully between these cliff sides that I could go down and back out. So there's other orchids in Nebraska besides Western Prairie Prince orchid. There's actually a lot of woodland orchid species at Indian Cave specifically. So this is Yale slipper. So this is probably the rarest orchid in Nebraska. There's probably less than 100 plants left in the state. And I have personal access to 2 of the populations remain in the state. So this is one of them. And these Nebraska's plants are smaller flowers than you might expect from specimens in Kentucky, but that's the variety, Septipedium parviflorum variety parviflorum. However, and this is a close-up of the pouch, just like white lady slipper, is a trap flower. But there is another population, an unusual population, more north of Omaha, that has more unusual anatomy traits. I just thought I'd discuss two. So the lateral petals on this one twist significantly more. This is on private property, it's a secret place. But it's always just something that I thought I might consider adding to the book as maybe a separate group, but I don't know if there's very much known about this plant specimen. But it's definitely yellow zipper, but there's debate if it's just an ancient relic population of something else or a hybrid or a new variety in the state, but there's so little known about it. And I know the Henry Doria Zoo is had done research on it, and Lorestan Gardens is interested in collecting seeds to culture it. But I know Roxy Keller has been studying it, so I definitely will have to contact her sometime to learn more about this population of what she's done from DNA analysis, because it's highly unusual anatomy based from my perspective because of these what you would not correlate this normally with I would think Cypripedium parviflorum, variety parviflorum, which but I know this habitat here is exceedingly high quality, very unusual, where I've seen rare plants there that are numbering in the thousands. So it's just probably a small pocket window what Nebraska's oak woodlands used to be centuries ago. There's other orchids, of course, woodland orchids such as showy orchis, a little tiny spring orchid that you find in oak woodlands that has pink and white flowers together. A close up of the flowers. This is another one with a long nectar spur, like listed at just like Western Prairie French orchid, but pretty large for the size of this flower. There's also some parasitic orchids in Nebraska. Not parasitic are plants, but fungi parasites. So if you remember, I said that orchids, terrestrial orchids in Nebraska form symbiotic relationships with underground fungi where most of them give stuff back, but this one doesn't give much back at all. But it's kind of got a showy flower. So there's two species in eastern and central Nebraska that I have photographed. The rest of the parasitic orchids are in the panhandle, but there's the spring one, which is this one, and there's the autumn one, which is not very showy at all. But this one has a much larger showy flower with the lip that has purplish spots on it. And a close up of the inflorescence. And this is cream false indigo. This I just really enjoyed this photo, but it's also wanted me to talk about one of my favorite places to do photography in the state for tallgrass prairies precisely, which is Rock Glen and Rock Creek Station in Jefferson County. So according to like the floor maps, range maps in the state, Jefferson County was a lot more, seemingly more well preserved than a lot of the other surrounding counties because there's a lot of areas down there that are a lot very rocky, which was not ideal to be made into agriculture. So they have some of the largest remaining tallgrass prairies in Nebraska. And this plant was just in the hundreds everywhere. So if you ever someone learn about this place or know where it is, I would definitely recommend going there to explore because it is a very wonderful, endless, almost endless prairie. It almost seems when you're standing in the middle of it. And close to the flowers. So back in the Sandhills in the Niobrara Valley, this was this year in the early spring. So a lot of you have probably heard of invasive eastern red cedar, but there is another native cedar species that is not invasive that's forming these dense shrubby beds like this. So this is actually one plant. This is a female creeping juniper specimen that, according to research by the Game Parks, is approximately 120 years old and measured about 120 feet in diameter. And I'm seeing that it can survive the fire just because it's just so big. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to talk to some people why this thing can survive fire so easily, so well. But with junipers and gymnosperms, they don't have flowers, but they do have spore production structures. And these little pinkish structures that you can see little flaps on those are the female pollen cones. So you've heard that gymnosperms or pines or cedars can produce cones, but there's something prior, which is the pollen or seed cones. And then later on is seed cones. So this is the juniper berry. So this is a technical seed cone. But I had photographed a female, but I needed a male next because I needed those reproductive parts. So that same day when I was in the Niobrara Valley back in, I think it was mid-April, I believe, I had been talking with the Niche Conservancy, and at Smith Falls, they had seen another creeping juniper specimen along one of the fire breaks up in the ponderosa pine forest. So this is actually a rare plant in Nebraska, just so you're aware. And luckily for me, when I found it off the trails on this along this fire break, it was a male. So this is the male pollen cones for this species. And according to the flora key, which I'll be discussing, there is differences between these structures of these stalks and the pollen cone structure from the eastern red cedar. So these will be identifiable by photos here. There's also been some new species in the state that I have discovered that I have been credited with. Some plants that were previously misidentified that I have identified properly, or were just completely missed, like this one, slender bush clover, which I found at Rock Creek Station in Jefferson County. So this is slender bush clover, a different bush clover species, Lespedesia virginica. And I was on the board group with the new next revision of Nebraska Natural Legacy Project, and this has been added to the state's list and will be a protected species in the state now. So this is more common in Kansas, but it just pokes into Nebraska, apparently in Jefferson County. It's close up to the flowers, or even for us, this is close up to the flowers. But with bush clovers, they do have two types of flowers, which is these are the insect pollinated flowers, but mixed in with the leaves are these little small flowers that never open to ensure self-pollination. This is the cleistogamous flowers. There's also a new orchid species in Nebraska that was recently discovered in the fall of 2023 that was fruiting by the Indian Cape staff. So this is a woodland lady trusses species. So this is Spranthys ovaris. So I got this one photographed. So I might have been one of the first people now in the state to have photos of the flowers. This is inflorescent, so a lot smaller than the other lady trusses species, and very different habitat because the other ones are all prairie associated or kind of more wet prairie or wetlands for some of them. And the flowers are pretty not showy, tiny. This was a wetland plant that I also discovered in the sandhill. So this is hump bladderwort, which is another new species, which is far disjunct from its main range. So this is actually a carnivorous plant where it has, these is the flowers, but they have these trapdoor bladder structures mixed in with the modified leaves that are submerged underwater that are hair triggered that when a small invertebrate like a mosquito larva or a water flea rubs up against these hairs, that they opens the trapdoor and sucks in the invertebrate to be digested by the plant. This is me taking out. So previously, there had been surveys on these sites, but the surveyors had been calling this lesser bladderwort, Utriculara minor, which is also rare in the state. But when I collected these specimens and had taken photos and brought them to David Sutherland at the University of Nebraska Omaha, he confirmed that this was actually hump bladderwort. And it has officially been added to the records now for Nebraska, and also is good information to know that lesser bladderwort is a lot rarer than we were originally thinking. There's another terrestrial bladderwort species that I photographed in the sandhills south of Atkinson in some of these acidic, very wet, sandy, circular areas along a highway that had a lot of other disjunct species in it. So this is zigzag bladderwort. So instead of being the water terrestrial, it actually feeds on nematodes and I believe protozoan organisms. So much smaller, there's my finger next to it, but this is the flower. So Nebraska's plants, if you look up zigzag bladderwort, Utriculara subulata, you might see open flowers with pictures online, but according to the literature and based on prior studies or observations by Stephen Rossmeyer, that Nebraska's plants always produce flowers that never open itself to self-pollinate, cleistogamous flowers. This is another red and showy plant. This is wood lily that I encountered along the highway near Bassett, I believe. There was quite the colony along there. This is a wetland lily. So if you've heard of Michigan lily or Turk's cap lily, that's more eastern Nebraska, but this one is more in the sandhills. There's also American ginseng present in Nebraska, but it is exceedingly rare because we've got limited available habitat for it. I've seen it actually grow on the same sites as the yellow lacer orchids. So if you've heard that it's been collected for its root because it's shaped like a person. So that, of course, in Chinese medicine, that means it's meant for people, but that's just a coincidence. But over collection, and because it takes years for them to be reproductively active, because it takes, I think, about 4 years before they produce their first fruits, and they need highly well preserved, undisturbed habitats that these populations do not recover quickly. So throughout their North American range, overcollection has led to their near demise. This is actually listed as threatened in Nebraska. So I was in eastern Nebraska for about a week and a half during to attend a funeral from my work at Bartha Brothers Ranch, that I decided to check all of my known ginseng populations in the state, and looking looking over them for 2 days, I finally found a suitable specimen that I said was ideal for photography, or this was the best specimen. And I took the close-up of the berries, and I actually have flower photos from earlier in the spring. So this one has been completed. Some other sedges of note that I want to discuss. This is Hall's bulrush, which is another rare tier 1 species sedge in the state, but there's two species that are very similar. So first, I had finished this plant doing photography in the East Sandhills, but there's another species that I decided I wanted to commit to, which is Rocky Mountain bulrush. But according to the literature, it was only known mostly on a private Sandhills lake near the Calamus Reservoir. So once I've gotten these photos done, I decided to commit to the Rocky Mountain bulrush populations. But first, when I contacted the landowner, which most of Nicole Lake is present on his property, I learned that he doesn't not have an answering machine. So I was having trouble contacting him, but I had learned that on the neighbor's property, which I had already done pensman photography on their property before, the lake barely crept onto their property. So fortunately, they were able to take me out into their ranger to the lake, which is pretty far out in their property. But problem is both this Hall's bulrush and Rocky Mountain bulrush grow together on the property. So the first night I was having trouble telling them apart, because the literature states that the styles on the fruits, this one's is in 2s, and Rocky Mountain bulrush is in 3s. But because I'm doing golden hour photography, trying to do the best lighting for photography, I could not see these, and these are pretty tiny. This is a macro photo. So the next night, I had told Robert Steinauer, who had done surveys years before on the property, about some questions like what he thought for feedback. So the next night, he told me to go back there and look at the achenes, the immature seed shape. So all the bulrush seeds are more lens shaped, and Rocky Mountain bulrush, immature seeds are more triangular in outline. So and you can see in the corner, I said there's about 500 to 1,500 plants left in Nebraska. So this is an exceedingly rare tiny bulrush sedge. So, and this is what I just had covered. So is there any questions? If I mentioned earlier with the Nebraska Native Plant Society, one of the reasons why I volunteer adding to Nebraska Native Plant Society is because it's also aiding me with networking, with connecting with a lot of organizations, conservation organizations in the state. And I also believe very strongly in the conservation mission for the state. So this is a photo of me with Jerry Steiner and Sarah Bailey on the Platte River North Platte Conference on the bus.
Well, that was fascinating, Drew. I so appreciate your amazing depth of knowledge, and that yellow lady slipper with those twirly petals. That's one of the coolest plants I've ever seen a photo of. So yeah, thank you for showing us that.
It's definitely probably one of the largest and oldest specimens left in the state, because I have not seen any other specimens that large.
Well, does anybody have any questions? That was a ton of material and just super interesting. Feel free to turn off your mic and ask Drew or drop it in the chat. We were talking earlier, Drew, tell our folks how many miles we typically drive in a plant season.
So from spring to summer to early fall, miles in my car is about on average 30 to 40,000 miles. So,
Yeah, it's a lot of driving.
so I
Okay,
spend
we
a
have a
lot of money on
question.
gas money.
Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. I hope you listen to audiobooks or something. Okay, so Joe wants to know how you keep track of all 1,200 species, and where you found them. It's a lot.
So I save a lot of the coordinates on my Onyx app, but also I have Asperger's autism syndrome, autism spectrum disorder. So honestly, I can just keep them all in my head, managed it. So this is just extreme autism spectrum skill sets. So like Einstein had Asperger's and all the other one. That's just their obsession, their skill set. So pretty much was all if all you think about is plants, you can manage it.
Well, you're putting those skills to very good use to benefit the rest of us and the state of Nebraska. So thank you for that. What kind of camera do you use? Michelle would like to know, what computer do you use to edit your pictures and what camera do you use?
So actually, I'm kind of very more purist based. So I don't like editing my photos to, but also I am currently using an iPhone for last season. I was using actually an iPhone 15 Pro Max because the iPhone technology has come a long way in recent years and because I'm not worried about distance and some of these plants are so tiny that it'd be pretty difficult to get a photo getting ground level of that plant. So, and also I'm taking on average about 30,000 photos each growing season. So this is more manageable in my mind. So I don't have to worry about distance. I'm entirely focused on plants and it's just easier, simpler. And because I did some comparisons with, like, showed some of my photos to Chris Heltzer. Like, besides not being able to blur out the background, which I'm against because I want to show habitat, he said they're not bad. So if Chris Heltzer says my photos are good for what I'm using it for, I think that's a green light.
Yeah. And tell us again who Chris Heltzer is. Does he work for Nature
He's the
Conservancy?
director of the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska, and he's a big time photographer in the state.
Yes. Yeah, his pictures are amazing. I've seen some of them floating around. So yeah, I agree. If he says your photos are good, then I think you're good to go.
Yeah, and the megapixel count is actually a lot higher than you might expect. I just upgraded to an iPhone 16 Pro Max, which has a 48 megapixel main lens. So I remember back in 2021, they only had 8 megapixel cameras. So it's going way up. And the camera technology is accelerating quickly. So I'm keeping up with the technology and upgrading constantly.
Yeah. Pamela would like to know if you think iNaturalists or citizen scientists could help you at all in your quest, or do you rely on those?
Yes, I add a lot of my photos to iNaturalist for recording for a record. A lot of them I actually obscure coordinates just because it's a rare plant, but it is a record in the state. Also, I have been using iNaturalist to help figure out trends like bloom times, like how is the growing season progressing, like in other states or in this state, like how behind or ahead are we? Because the dry conditions in the winter has a tendency to make things a lot like 1 to 2 weeks late. It's especially if evident in the spring ephemerals. But iNaturalist was also very helpful for some of these plants that have very brief bloom durations for even like time of day of when I should find observe the flowers. Like like hoary frostweed, according to most of people who actually documented this exceedingly difficult plant to catch a flower, most of them were about 11 a.m. in the morning. Or twisted yellow star grass. Most people observe open flowers at 9 a.m.
Wow. Yeah, that I could see how that would be super useful. cool. Bob is curious if you are planning on tackling the Panhandle area at all.
So when I had first proposed this idea with Jerry Steinauer to make an all-encompassing field guide, he strongly encouraged me to split in half to do eastern central Nebraska and western and Panhandle. At first, he thought two reasons. First, he thought I would never get all of those species together, and it might be more reasonable to do eastern central Nebraska, see how you go. But also, he said the habitats are so extremely different for even some of these plants that grow in the same habitat or same that's range overlaps into like eastern Nebraska. But for example, it's like what's it called? Indian paintbrush. Like you see it like in the all over common in the panhandle in some of these like rocky areas, but the habitat's quite different in eastern Nebraska, I think, on these high slopes. David, would you agree with that?
I'm not sure. I've only seen it here in eastern Nebraska.
Yeah, I've seen Sarah Bailey's photos in the Panhandle, and it's growing in a lot of these. It's pretty common out there in the Panhandle, apparently, a lot more common than elsewhere. But if I was going to do photography in the Panhandle, I would want a lot of plants being in the Panhandle in their natural habitat.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about your book. Is there a publication timeline or release date? Any more information about when we can expect to see that on the shelves?
So the University of Nebraska Lincoln, her library is interested in the book, but they have requested that I complete it first before they throw funds to it. So, but fortunately, David Sutherland has offered his botany expertise to assist with it. Currently, I am producing the second draft of the field guide. So I had this open earlier. So these are some of the pages that I'm currently working on. These are the ones that I have produced the second draft for. So this is like snow trillium, another very rare plant in the state, and some other ones. These are the pussy toes, for example, all different species.
Oh,
And
I think you have to close your PowerPoint so because we can't see the other window that you have open.
does it work now?
I'm not seeing your book pages.
Oh, screen sharing is paused.
Oh, huh.
Does it work now?
No,
Hmm.
yeah.
Well,
Well, that's okay. We'll just have to use our imagination.
okay.
So you're on your second draft.
Yes.
And so is the book, you've completed all of the species that you're going to include in the book, or do you still have more that are going to be in this volume?
So as long as I'm typing pages, I can keep adding to it, I think, in my opinion. So during the growing season, I can still be active in the field, but I will make my best attempt to make it all encompassing, which I've gotten the worst stuff behind me, and there's only a few plants left that I need to retake photos up where it's not up to my standard now. So mostly it's adding new things in, but most of them I know where they are located on. I just need to make time to get to them while I'm also assisting with research and teaching online courses. But I am committed enough that anytime I have free time, I will be doing photography. Does it? A lot of times when I was out west at Nyberg Dive Preserve or Barth Brothers Ranch, I do 8 to 10 hours of work in the field, and then I do a couple 2 to 3 hours of photography every single night. Didn't matter, and I had the energy for it still. I don't get tired in the evening.
You.
Yeah,
I
lucky you.
cannot say the same. So Dave, do you want to introduce yourself? Are you like advisor and professor that you work with Drew?
I'm a long retired professor from UNO. I've been retired for about 20 years, and I worked on two editions of The Flora of Nebraska. I'm one of the co-authors, and I really appreciate what Drew is doing.
Thank you.
I
It's
have a
amazing.
I have a comment on that orchid that's the yellow lady slipper that's north of Omaha. It's not only that the sepals and petals are very twisted, but the proportion of the flower is different.
Yeah, it's
The,
smaller.
the lip is smaller and the petals are longer. So,
Yeah.
and the plant is taller. I mean, it's really a spectacular plant.
Yeah, I'm hoping maybe Roxy might have a name attached to it. I might have it as a separate page with the LA zipper.
Maybe somebody else has named it. I don't know. But there are varieties named for Cypripedium parviflorum, so maybe
Well, it's
someone.
cool. I think it should
Yeah.
be named for Drew. Drew's
Yeah.
lady slipper. Well, unless there's other questions, I think we can probably wrap it up. I don't think I missed any in the chat. Lots of thank yous, lots of compliments, Drew, about your project and your photographs and the scope of your project. So everybody is very much appreciating your work, and we are so grateful that you have taken an hour to spend with us today. So thank you so much for preparing your presentation and for being here to talk with our members and friends. We really appreciate it. Oh, one other question. Has Drew ever visited any Wachusca prairies?
Several of them actually. Private, public, a lot of them. Sometimes I have issues with the landowners haying the prairie a little bit earlier than I was hoping, but I've been talking with Tim Knott about getting a prairie that has Culver's native population of Culver's root on it. That hopefully the farmer doesn't hay in early July like he did last summer. So I can probably hopefully get Culver's root photographed next summer, integrated into the field guide, Nebraska, because I'm trying to maximize priority with plants present in Nebraska.
Right. Yeah. Well, finally, you mentioned a plant that I'm familiar with, so I got one.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Drew, so much for being here today. And thanks to everybody who was with us listening to Drew's presentation. And we will see you all next Thursday for planting underneath trees. Till then, have a great week. Thanks, Drew. Bye.
Welcome.